Africa's richest man just delivered one of the bluntest warnings of his career. Speaking to finance ministers, trade officials, and diplomats at the 2026 Africa Caucus meeting in the Gambia, Aliko Dangote told the continent's policymakers something they may not want to hear. Without deliberate industrial transformation, Africa has no credible path to prosperity. Before we begin, kindly subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. His words were direct. No country in modern economic history has achieved high-income status without industrialization. Not one. He pointed to Britain, the United States, South Korea, China, and Vietnam. Each of these economies escaped poverty not through luck, but through deliberate policy. Sustained infrastructure investment. Export orientation. Coordinated industrial planning. None of it happened by accident. Now Dangote is putting numbers behind the warning. Africa's population is projected to hit 2.5 billion people by 2050. That growth, he said, will become a liability rather than an advantage unless the continent creates roughly 20 million new jobs every single year. Only an industrial economy has the scale to deliver that many jobs. Nothing else comes close. Here's the contradiction Dangote keeps returning to. Africa holds close to 18% of the world's population. It sits on roughly 30% of global mineral reserves. It has nearly 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land. And yet it remains the least industrialized region on Earth. Manufacturing makes up only 10 to 11% of Africa's GDP. Compare that to East Asia, where manufacturing accounts for more than 25%. Africa's share of global merchandise exports has stagnated at around 3%, and more than 70% of what the continent does export is still raw, unprocessed commodities. To understand why Dangote keeps citing South Korea and Vietnam, it helps to look at the timeline. In the 1960s, South Korea's income per person was lower than Ghana's. Within 3 decades, deliberate industrial policy, protected manufacturing sectors, export incentives, and heavy investment in steel, shipbuilding, and electronics turned it into one of the wealthiest economies in Asia. Vietnam followed a similar script more recently, positioning itself as a manufacturing alternative to China and pulling in hundreds of billions of dollars in factory investment over the past 15 years. Dangote's argument is that Africa possesses the same raw ingredients these countries started with: cheap labor, natural resources, and geographic access to major markets, but has consistently failed to convert them into an industrial base. The cost of that gap is enormous. Dangote estimates Africa loses between $40 and $50 billion every single year by shipping raw materials abroad, only to buy them back later as finished goods at a markup. Crude oil goes out, refined fuel comes back in at a premium. Cocoa beans go out, chocolate comes back in. Lithium goes out, batteries come back in. Each cycle transfers value away from the continent that produced the raw material in the first place. Dangote isn't just diagnosing the problem. He's putting his own money on the table. Under what his company calls Dangote Vision 2030, the Dangote Group plans to invest $46 billion across Africa over the next 4 years. Part of that plan includes a new 700,000 barrel per day refinery in Lamu, on Kenya's coast, expected to come online as early as September or October this year. It would add to a portfolio that already includes the $20 billion refinery and petrochemical complex outside Lagos, a facility Dangote holds up as proof that African-led projects can compete on a genuinely global scale. But Dangote was also careful to say that industrialization alone will not save Africa. Building factories without dismantling trade barriers between African nations, he argued, will not be enough. He pointed to the African Continental Free Trade Area, a bloc covering a combined GDP of more than $3.5 trillion and a market of 1.5 billion people, as one of the most consequential initiatives the continent has undertaken since independence. Industrialization and integration, he said, have to move together. Neither one works on its own. He also took direct aim at the cost of moving goods within Africa itself. In his words, it remains more expensive to transport goods between some African countries than to import products from Europe. That's not a minor inefficiency. It's a structural barrier that undercuts the entire case for building factories on the continent in the first place, because those factories still need functioning trade routes to reach African consumers. Beyond trade barriers, Dangote also flagged financing as one of the biggest obstacles standing in the way of African industrial projects. Large-scale manufacturing and refining require patient capital, often billions of dollars committed over a decade or more before a project turns a profit. Many African governments and local banks simply don't have balance sheets that size, which forces industrial developers to seek financing from international lenders who charge a steep risk premium for African projects, even when the underlying economics are sound. Dangote has argued that this risk premium itself becomes a self-fulfilling problem. Higher borrowing costs make projects less viable, which reinforces the perception that African industrial investment is inherently riskier than it actually is. Energy access compounds the problem. Unreliable power supply remains one of the most cited reasons multinational manufacturers choose to build factories in Southeast Asia rather than sub-Saharan Africa. Dangote's own businesses have had to build captive power plants simply to keep operations running, an added cost that manufacturers in Vietnam or Bangladesh rarely have to absorb. Without a stable, affordable grid, the economics of industrial-scale manufacturing become difficult to sustain regardless of how favorable trade policy becomes. It's worth noting that Dangote's framing isn't universally accepted. Some economists and journalists have pushed back on how much of his own industrial empire actually builds local technical capacity, pointing out that much of the skilled engineering and management work across his refinery and cement operations still relies on foreign contractors. That doesn't erase the substance of his warning about Africa's raw material dependency, but it's a reminder that the loudest voice calling for African industrialization is also one of its biggest beneficiaries. Still, the timing of this warning matters. Global supply chains are being restructured. Demand for critical minerals is surging because of the energy transition. Digital technologies are lowering the cost of manufacturing at smaller scales than ever before. Dangote described this moment as perhaps the greatest industrial opening Africa has seen in 50 years. The question now is whether African governments treat that opening as urgent, or whether the continent spends another generation exporting what it grows and digs up, only to import it back as someone else's finished product. That's the story. If you found this useful, subscribe for more coverage of African infrastructure, industry, and economic policy.